Hello, my name is Faith Kilgo. I am a doctoral student at Rice State University School of Professional Psychology, and I will be discussing a literature review called The Effects of Prenatal Drug Abuse and Nicotine on Children and Their Development, a review of the literature. I want to begin by outlining the central focus of my study, which is understanding how prenatal exposure to drugs and nicotine shapes early brain development and long-term development trajectories. In the abstract, I also want to discuss about how prenatal exposure to drugs and nicotine is linked to disruptions in fetal brain development and later developmental challenges. I also want to discuss about how exposed children show higher rates of ADHD symptoms, antisocial behaviors, and learning difficulties. Research also identifies altered cognitive development over time, which contributes to emotional dysregulation and reduced social interaction. Overall, the review synthesizes findings across developmental, behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and educational domains. It also identifies gaps in understanding long term developmental impacts, emphasizing the need for future research and intervention efforts. Methods. I conducted a comprehensive literature search using Wright State University's library databases and OhioLink. I used a combination of keywords like prenatal, drugs, abuse, nicotine, and effects. I then included only peer-reviewed empirical studies focused on prenatal substance exposure and developmental or neurobiological outcomes. I screened articles for relevance to fetal development, child outcomes, and substance specific effects. I intentionally targeted studies that examined multiple substances to compare similarities and differences across drug types. I then organized selected literature by patterns, themes, and outcome domains such as cognitive, behavioral, structural, and functional. I then prioritized studies that discuss developmental and neurobiological models to support interpretations of mechanisms underlying risks. Finally, I synthesized findings by identifying consistent patterns, substance specific effects, and gaps in the literature. Overall, my research question was: how does prenatal drug abuse and nicotine impact children's long term development? Findings included the neurodevelopmental impact, brain structures and functioning, environmental results, and I also found key gaps and implications of past research. I found that prenatal exposure to substances including alcohol, opioids, cocaine, and nicotine is associated with lower IQ, learning problems, intellectual disability, attention and hyperactivity difficulties. I also found that longitudinal studies in neuroimaging show persistent structural and functional brain abnormalities. These include the left hemisphere disruptions, reduced thalamic volume, and altered activations in regions like the caudate. This is linked to language, broader cognitive deficits, and impulse control. Another major finding was that developmental outcomes are not biologically determined alone. The quality of caregiving, family or household stability, and socioeconomic status can either buffer or exacerbate risk. The major gap is understanding how multiple drug exposures interact biologically to show structural functioning and metabolic brain outcomes, and how these mechanisms interact with environmental contexts to influence developmental trajectories. This is a figure that displays different factors with examples of each factor that affects prenatal exposed children neurodevelopment. The factors include biological, societal, parent-child, and pre-pregnancy factors. Thank you for listening to my poster presentation. At the bottom right corner is the QR code for my references. Have a great rest of your day.